Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, big conference, for inviting me here, and I hope that today's presentation will be useful for everyone here. And early disclaimer, this is applicable for any storefront that your game is in. Doesn't matter if it's mobile, computer, or a console. So make sure that you take notes because this is applicable for everyone, I think, here and online. So to translations and beyond, localize your ASO far away from just translating, but to your culture and the language. So first of all, allow me to present myself. Also, Antonio did a great introduction. So I've been working in marketing for over 12 years. 11 of those years I was doing paid campaigns, 7 of those years in SEO, and 4 of those more specified about ASO. And currently I'm working at Gameloft. So the topic that brought us here today is why localizing, why we need to work on localizations, why are localizations crucial to have, what is localization. So let's start, why are localizations crucial to have in all the different storefronts? So localizations is how you're going to be portraying your game in the different storefronts that you are in. This is going to be affecting mainly your organic visibility, so which are the user's intent query, if those match the search terms that they are using, if when they are searching for your listing, what they are seeing is according also to their regional references, to the culture approaches. If you're localizing it correctly on the listing of your main game, you can also do the same localizations for the events that you're having. It doesn't matter the platform that you're in. It could be in Microsoft, in Google Play, and iOS, and other storefronts. If you have events and live ops content going on, you also need to focus on the localizations of those, not only translating, but also taking into account which are the cultural references of the visual assets that you are using to improve the reach of it. This is also going to be affecting the featuring eligibility of your game in those storefronts. So as we were talking about other storefronts before, other people were explaining how they work. So the editorial teams of each storefront and each country will revise your content. If it's not complying with what they are culturally referring to, which are the culture colors, for example, that have different meanings and different connotations, this is not going to be correctly seen by the editorial teams of those countries, by the storefront, and you will have less organic visibility through these featurings because your content will not be matching what the users of those regions intend to see when they are looking for a game that matches your intentions of keywords. Also, this is going to affect your paid campaigns because some paid campaigns can be done through the networks of the different platforms that your game will be published. So if those cultural connotations that you're approaching on the writing and visual assets does not comply with the political views of those countries, the editorial team of those paid campaigns for those countries will also maybe cancel your campaigns, will give your campaigns less visibility, and at the end of the day, your cost might be higher, or even your campaigns might not be running because of it. So it's also important to get to know this. And another way that paid campaigns can be affecting is because though you might be doing paid campaigns through different networks outside of the storefront, your user is also going to be landing on this listing. And if those listings are not correctly approached to the cultural connotations of those countries and languages, you will not be having the correct conversion rate for those campaigns. And so, talking about localizations, localizations are important. We know for which points localizations are important. So let's go more in depth about what are localizations, because we know that this is not just word-by-word translation. Localization is adapting your content to cultural and language connotations. This means, yes, translating, but also translating in the way that the user of those countries and languages are going to be perceiving your content, how you're going to be writing it, how you're going to be making cultural references, and also visually, how you're going to be adapting your visuals, because in Western countries, the ways of the guidelines and policies of the storefronts work are different from other areas of the world. We can see how positively perceived countries will react because of the languages, connotations, and the colors, and the different elements that we're going to be using. But also we need to take into account that you will not only be seeing how your game is doing by the conversion rate results, but also by the reviews that the users are going to be leaving on your game. because this is not only something that localizations should be taken into account on the listing, but also in-game. So you need to match the localizations in-game with the localizations of how you're presenting your game on the different storefronts, on the different listings. So if you see that the listing is properly localized for cultural and language connotations, but in-game it's not properly localized, maybe it is still in English as a default language, or maybe you're using visual assets and not correctly understood by the different cultures, it's also important to take those notes on the reviews into account, as well as which is the localization that you're using on the listing, and try to move it inside the game to properly approach the user when they are playing. Another goal of localization is to work on the keyword strategy. We were talking about before of the word-by-word localization, of the word-by-word translation. This is not the proper way, because there are specific languages that they don't have an alphabetical word-by-word language as the different ABCs that we have in Western countries, but they have different characters for their languages, and those characters cannot match the way that we are writing in Western societies. So in order to do that, we need to take into account how we can provide a better version of our game on the app name, subtitle, and the different writing assets that we have on the listing store. So we need to make consciously the localization of those assets and try to also portray the name of the game if needs to be translated in the adequate way. We also need to take into account which are going to be the acronyms that you're going to be using. Is your game name also going to be used as an acronym? You want to adapt some acronyms of general types of games like RPG to how your game is going to be portrayed. But then is RPG understood the same way in the different countries, in the different cultures? If not, you need to find the right acronym way, the right word to appropriately talk about your game in those cultures. Another way would be to adapt your in-game and the listings content about which is the currency, which are the cultural important dates, which is the calendar festivities that they are going to be feeling more approachable to them versus what you're using for the strategy overall in the rest of the world. And then take into account that to not only on the main game, but also on the DLCs, as well as on the live ops content, to optimize the reach and the monetization also of the game, which is the final goal of it all. As I was talking about visual assets, you also need to take into account if you are portraying real people or characters in-game, that those match the beauty standards of each culture. This way, the user is going to feel more approachable by the content that you are selling to them. They're going to be seeing that your content is more fitting to the culture, so they will see that your game is taking more into account their approach, their culture, and their, in a way, audience that they're having on that country. They might feel more prone to download your game and play it and have a longer lifetime value. So as this is all a really wide topic, and there are several cultures, regions that we could be talking about. Today I wanted to focus more on the Asian ones, which are the ones that we have so many different cultural connotations, so many different languages that are about characters and not really about the different letters that we will be using in Western countries. So on today's presentation, I'm going to try to brief you out some of the main points that you should be taking into account when localizing for different countries and languages in Asia, as well as I will be showcasing some of the examples of how we're doing it on Gameloft. So starting with Southeast Asia and Asia-Pacific countries, this is one of the main elements that you should be taking into account, which is make sure that you are portraying the core of your game correctly when you are translating your game from the English default language to the other languages that they are using there. As I was mentioning before, there are several languages that you should be taking into account on a wider weight on the fact of which are the characters and the way that they are writing in those languages that we are not maybe that familiar with, like traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, and other ones. So we need to make sure that when we are approaching the topic of localization with the in-house, maybe a localization team, or with an external agency, we take into account which is the core value of the game, which are the main messages that we want to share, and that those are correctly understood by the localizations team that are going to be making this sort of translation localization content. So the main core would be like our colleague was saying before for PlayStation. If your app name can be having different connotations or the subtitle different connotations when you're translating it in the different languages, you need to maybe rethink on the concept of, does my game need to be translating the app name to these other languages? Maybe maintaining it on the original English name would be sufficient for the branding, or we need to make it more approachable to other languages. Maybe we don't need to translate it word by word, but we need to maybe take into account which is going to be the vocalization in their other languages. So maybe we can do that approach for the localization of the app name and other assets. Also, something that is really important is to take into account color, the color of our marketing brand, the color of our icon, the visual assets, how are we portraying that? It's something really tricky and sensitive topic in Asian countries and Asian cultures. For example, we have the red color in several countries, like for example in Korea, is associated with bad omens. But for example, we can see that in China mainland, it's a color of luck, and this color that it's mainly used, for example, when we talk about Chinese New Year and Lunar New Year content. So we need to make sure that when we're portraying that, if we need to also do that live ops content, that event content for other regions, we need to take into account which is going to be the meaning of the color. It's not going to be the same one in China mainland as in other Asia regions, for example. Also, when we talk about the black color, usually has a negative connotation, but in Western cultures, we're usually using the black color as a color of simplicity, but this is not portrayed the same way in Asia. So we need to make sure that also our branding there can match their intentions and their needs culturally and make it more approachable for them to download our game. Another content that can be used for colors would be that the blue, the purple, green usually has positive connotations. We need to make sure that those connotations that each of these colors are portraying are the right ones over the content that we are going to be showcasing in visual assets, as well as we want to, for example, adapt the icon for a specific festivity or for a specific content that we're going to be releasing in-game. We need to make sure that those colors are correctly portrayed by the country and the culture that we are approaching per each storefront. Also, another thing would be, this can be applied for apps, but also for games, the yellow. If we talk about yellow, usually represent positive qualities, but in China mainland, it indicates sexual content. If our game is not really focused on that, we might need to rethink the branding of that content for that country, because it can have a bad effect and a bad visual connotation, not only for the users, but even for the editorial team that are going to be reviewing your game, in the sense of, are we going to be wanting to feature this game? Do we want a game that has that importance and that strength for the yellow color on their icon, for example, or their marketing visual assets, versus another game that might be more appealing to the cultural connotations of that country for the sense? Two of the main languages that usually we talk about and we discuss when we're talking about localizations in Asia are traditional Chinese and simplified Chinese. As we were mentioning before, maybe you don't need to translate your app name to those languages or to other Asian languages that are not about letter-based, but are more about character-based in their language. So for traditional simplified Chinese, what you can do is try to match the meaning of your app name to their language, but a best practice would be to also keep the English name on your app name. This way you can have both matches on the search queries of the users, but also you keep your branding outside of it. Also for Korean, for example, if that was the case, we could just keep the vocalization in Hangul, in the Korean language, of the name of your game, so that could be also an easy way to solve this issue. Another element would be that in order to analyze which is the impact of your game in Asian cultures, especially in China mainland, it is more recommendable to use ASO tools that are local on those countries. So for example, Western tools sometimes cannot have the wider view of what is going on in those countries, in those storefronts. Therefore, the information that you might be receiving there might be more limited. That is why China mainland and other Asian countries have other ASO tools that can help you have a better visibility of what might be going on in your game and how also you can run some benchmarks over how you're doing versus your competitors. And this way you can have a more wider approach of that analysis by local teams, by editorial teams of those regions that will enhance your game visibility there. Another topic that is also really sensitive are elements that might be controversial under culture, elements that might be even illegal. For example, in Singapore, where they speak simplified Chinese, chewing gum is illegal. Make sure that if your game is about an activity that maybe are promoting gum, or you have an IP collaboration, a crossover with a brand that has gum, that you're portraying it the correct way, because if not, that content might not have the reach that you're expecting, or might not have the correct connotations for the audience that you're reaching there. There are other elements that you need to avoid on visual assets as well as on writing assets. Even if your game is about war, you shouldn't be portraying a specific way of the weapons, how the weapons are maybe pointing out to the user. You should avoid having blood on your visuals. You should also avoid specific bellic topics that might be between different cultures or countries in Asia that might be making your game be even unpublished in those countries because of the policies and the political actions that the government in those countries might be taking into account for the stores, and also the editorial content might not want to hire the visibility of your game because of that, and it can also be affecting paid campaigns, as we were mentioning before. Another element to take into account are religions, which are the religions that are praised in those countries, which are the main religions that are praised in those countries. So if you're having some content regarding Christmas or you have content regarding Easter, it's really the right content for those countries. It's really the right approach that you want to have for a DLC or an event in those countries for your game. So maybe you need to rethink the strategy in those specific areas and regions that you want your game to reach their goal for organic visibility as well as for paid campaigns. One specific topic that it's about traditional and simplified Chinese would be the iOS keywords field. When we're talking about the App Store, it applies for macOS, tvOS, as well as for iOS, for iPhone, and iPad. Those languages, as we were mentioning before, the characters have their own connotations, do not match one letter. They match different concepts and different ideas. So that is why when we're writing the keywords there, we might not need to use commas between those elements to the algorithm and the editorial team to understand the strategy behind it, because as each character can have their own meaning, the fact that you are going to be writing them all, it's going to be having the correct approach for the algorithm there, instead of having to maybe divide them between commas, which is a field that is also present in other stores like PlayStation, Xbox, Microsoft, Nintendo. So this is something that can be applied to any other storefront. To sum up some of the main countries, cultures, and languages that might be the top ones for your monetization forecast and monetization goals, I have tried to summarize some of the top ones here, taking into account which are the main rules and best practices that you should be following up on the different writing assets and visual assets of your listings, as well as the right approach to your audience. For the app name, usually you should be focusing on the local language, except in Thailand, where it is a best practice and it's okay by the editorial teams that you have your app name in English. But then the subtitle, or what would be like the promo text, you should be having it on the local language. This way, you're not only going to be matching the user's queries and intent of the search, but also you're going to be more approachable to their culture and language, as we were mentioning before. They might be more prone to the conversion over the fact that you are talking to them in their own local language, instead of just having the English version, having it as a default for the listing. It also applies for keywords. As you're going to be having some English on the Thailand, for example, you don't need to focus on English content on the keyword strategy that you're going to be having across the different writing assets. It is easier if you just focus it on the local language, so the users are feeling it more approachable to their reach, to their culture, and to their language and intentions. Also to take into account, as I was mentioning before with the religions, which is the reach of English content and English knowledge in those countries. That is why if you're just using the default language, the English one, for this content, that might not be the right approach. Users might not be doing searches in English that can match your strategy of keywords. So if you're not having something in simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, or Japanese or Korean, for example, your game might not ever be showing up as a result for their intention of search. On the screenshots as well, you need to have taglines and marketing writing assets that are about the local language. And you need to have the right approach of the visual assets, which in many of the Asian cultures and countries is really different from what we approach and we apply for the Western countries and cultures. The way that you're going to be seeing in the previous slides, the visual assets that we have for Asian cultures is really different from the approach that usually is even specified for guidelines for Western countries. You need to maybe run a benchmark with the ASO tools, the local ones that I was mentioning before. This way you can have the right approach of how you're going to be portraying your game in there. And this also applies for the video. On the video, it's the best practice to have it on a local language and also to apply the visual assets guidelines of those cultures there. But it's also maybe more interesting for you to not have audio, to just have some taglines that are appearing throughout the explanation of the game. Maybe it is also easier for you because most of the stores and most of the users might not have the audio on, and the video might be playing on autoplay. So this way, you can save up on those costs of translating the audio, but you can still have some taglines that are about the language that you're trying to approach here, and which are going to be the cultural connotations that you're going to be portraying on the narrative of that video. And so, as I was mentioning before, I want to show you some of the examples of localizations that we work at Gameloft. In this case, I wanted to portray first one of the war games that I was talking about before. On the Bellic conflicts, there are different elements that you should be avoiding, but also some other ones that are right to tackle in the different cultures, and the way that we are going to be tackling it about Japan, in this case, it's going to be different, for example, that the approach that you should be having when you're talking about it on a traditional Chinese or simplified Chinese speaking country, as well as in the US. For example, on the screen, you can see that even the structure that we have for the taglines is different. That is because if you go through the story in Japan and through the cultural references that Japan as a country, as well as the cultural of Japanese has, is a different way of visually portraying elements. This is why on the visual assets in many stores, you will see that the taglines, the structure of it, and the colors of it are different of, for example, what you can have in the US. As I was explaining at the beginning, the red color is not something that is well understood or that can have some bad omens connotations in Asian countries. That is why on the US listing, on the screenshots, you can see that we hired it on the taglines. The background wasn't red. This way, we wanted also to approach the bellic element, the blood element, whereas in Japan, we avoid red. We have more happy colors, we would say. We have the green, which has positive meanings. We have the energy of green. We have the luck elements that this color translates, as well as we have some orangey and white ones, which are the colors of pureness, as well as of braveness. And this is something that is also important to highlight in a bellic game, on a war game. the way that we are also portraying the visual assets. You can see on the Japanese screenshots that the gameplay is portrayed in different screens inside the same screenshot. This is something that in other countries and cultures would be against the guidelines. The guidelines in Japan and other Asian countries are different for that sense. For example, if you were portraying it with only just one screenshot, you would see that all your competitors are using different visual composures over how you're going to be portraying the game there. That is why it's important to analyze which is the market in that culture and then translate it on how you're going to be portraying your game. Another game that we have is Dragon Mania Legends. Here you can also see the different structure of the visual assets. You can also see how we have moved from the yellow color that we were seeing before that in specific countries has a connotation that we might not want to have on a game that can be also perceived for kids and family. We moved that to a more white for the pureness of this color, as well as blue, which is the color of lag in specific cultures. And then we also had this different structure overlapping different visual elements to match the culture of those countries. Even if you take a look at which are the dragons that we have portrayed, the way that we're portraying those is a more childish way than what we are portraying those dragons on other Western cultures, for example, on the US. This is a way also to approach and match which are the visual assets that are preferred in those cultures, that the users might be more fond of, and that might feel more approachable to their specific selection. Then, another game, in this case, is an IP game, is a Disney game, how we are portraying such a huge IP, such a huge brand in a specific culture of Japan. Also, in this case, I also wanted to go through Germany as one example of how we would even localize an IP-specific game for different countries, not only in Asia, but also worldwide. If we start by how is the approach in the US versus Japan, you also see the different structure on visual assets. You can see how we are taking it more of a step further on what would be marketing assets and take the different structure and overlapping one element with the other, as well as which are the colors that are more prominent on the text, for example. Again, we don't have here red, for example, nor yellow. We have it of an orangey, as well as a purple lilac color, which are colors of pureness, of calmness, and also to positive meanings. This is the way that we want it to be perceived by the whole audience that we are reaching out. We are aiming to reach for families as well as for kids. This is why this is more of a positive approach on the visual assets. On the US, for example, if you compare it with Germany, you can see that the order of the characters IPs is different. This is based on CMI analysis of which are the more important and more famous IPs of characters of Disney in that country. We saw that Ariel from The Little Mermaid is more famous in that country, whereas in the US or other Western countries. That is why we tried to try different orders of screenshots until we found the best match of the formula for increasing the conversion rate of those assets in that specific country. Same way when we see which are the IPs represented in Japan. The audience there is really broad and are really fond of IPs. If you can have a game with IPs, if you can go a step higher and present them as much as you can on the visual assets, this is something that they are going to be thankfully in you. This is why we try to scale up, which is a portfolio of IPs we're showcasing on the visual assets. This is why you can see different stories portrayed, for example, on the third screenshot of Japan, whereas on all the other localizations for Western, we have more of a IP-based screenshot, and then you have a general view of what the game might be looking at. But then on Japan, we portray how it can be perceived by the user, the experience of the in-game content. Then some examples of how you should be also localizing visual assets. In this case, are apps, but if your game, for example, has VR or AR and can also be applying to portray different people's faces and different character faces, as I was mentioning before, it is also important that the people you're portraying there, or even if those are characters, can match the beauty standards of those cultures. This way, you can see here how for Japan and Korea, the writing assets are localized, not just translated. You can also see how the discussion boxes are localized, as well as the people portrayed on the visual assets match their beauty standards by culture. Same thing can be applied for other apps, where you can see how the visual approach of those cultures and their references and the cultural connotations of the people portraying the visuals can feel more approachable for the users that are going to be seeing those screenshots and then decide to download the game or the app, whereas on other ones that might be using a more general approach might not be the main core of their localization. So you can see then on the category rankings, for example, which are the top ones, which means which are the most downloaded ones, might not be because of a marketing activations, but because the audience are feeling that this content is more appealing to their culture and their language references. Thank you so much, everyone.
Si tenéis alguna pregunta. Aquí.
¿Castellano o inglés?
Me da igual.
Vale. Tenía dos preguntitas. Una,
Okay.
en países occidentales, ¿cuántos cambios, o sea, cuántas veces dirías que hacéis cambios no lingüísticos? Y dos, ¿cómo cobráis? ¿Por hora, por proyecto, por palabra? ¿Cómo se plantea?
La segunda, no cobramos, o sea, es in-house el equipo de localizaciones. Y para países, por ejemplo, en Japón, tenemos equipo local de allí, entonces las referencias locales de cultura y de cómo escribir algo están mejor analizado, por ejemplo, que cuando pues, anteriormente he tenido otros trabajos donde íbamos a agencias, igual la localización no era tan accurate como podemos tenerla ahora con un equipo local. Y la primera pregunta, ¿cuántos cambios hacemos no lingüísticos? ¿Te refieres a visuales, por ejemplo? Intentamos tener, por cada update o cada lanzamiento de una DLC o incluso un hotfix, una actualización de visual elements en las diferentes stores. O sea, da igual si es Nintendo, PlayStation, Microsoft, Xbox. Eso por un lado. Luego, si además estamos intentando hablar con la tienda para tener un destacado concreto, ahí también vamos a hacer unos visuales que sean más appealing para el editorial content que va a analizar ese contenido, que pueda hacer un poco un match con lo que les estamos presentando en el pitch deck, para que haga un match también con lo que la audiencia va a poder luego ver cuando se va a estar en el destacado y cuál va a ser la colección del destacado. Y luego, aparte de esto, te diría que si no hay ningún update a la vista o si no hay ninguna actualización o DLC o evento que se vaya a lanzar, intentamos ir, si es una tienda que permite experimentos, tener experimentos activos para también cuál va a ser el siguiente approach de elementos visuales, tanto si es por un seasonal content o como si va a ser un evergreen content, ir probando pues, lo que te he enseñado, por ejemplo, de Disney, el orden de las IPs, hacer también testings internos, cuáles son las IPs que la gente invierte más dinero, cuáles son las IPs que la gente busca más en la tienda, cuáles son las tendencias de búsqueda en esos países y poder también ver si es el mismo approach en los elementos visuales. Y para juegos que no son de IP, lo mismo. Si tenemos el juego de dragones, Dragon Mania Legends, y vemos que hay más gente que opta por jugar con los dragones de agua que con los dragones de fuego, vamos a intentar ver si ese approach en elementos visuales también se respondería de la misma forma a nivel de conversión. Entonces también ir haciendo un update, no solamente en esas tiendas que permiten experimentos, sino ver si un match de esos visuales que estamos testeando ahí en otras tiendas como consolas o ordenador podría hacer también incrementar el conversion rate, o si, por ejemplo, puede bajarlo o puede bajar la visibilidad por la forma que el algoritmo trabaja ahí, o como las campañas de paid dentro de la misma tienda están viendo de una forma diferente el algoritmo, están viendo de una forma diferente los colores que estás utilizando, los caracteres, etcétera. Poder también hacer un approach de cuál es el user intent, but also entender el algoritmo, cómo está leyendo nuestro contenido.
Muchas gracias, Claudia. No tenemos tiempo para más. Fuerte aplauso.